In 2019, a television series taught the world what happened at Chernobyl. It was extraordinary television. It was also, in places, completely invented. Millions of people now believe things about the worst nuclear accident in history that simply never happened. And here's the part that should interest you. Not all of those inventions came from a screenwriter, some of them came from a government. These are 7 myths about Chernobyl, and you will not believe who invented the last one. It is not a story someone told to make the disaster more exciting. It is one somebody told to stay out of prison, and it cost a 25-year-old engineer his name. Start with the easy one. You have seen the image of the miners, tunneling under the reactor, working completely naked in the darkness. It is one of the most famous scenes in the series, and it is wrong. The heat down there was real and brutal, climbing towards 60 degrees, and the men did strip off what clothing they could because their masks filled with sweat and became useless. But they were not naked. The people who have interviewed the surviving miners are blunt about it. It was an invented detail, added because the truth was apparently not desperate enough on its own. That is the pattern to watch for. The real story is usually strange enough. Somebody just decided it needed help. Which brings us to the most photographed object in the entire disaster. The elephant's foot, that dark, glassy mass slumped on a basement floor, the thing every short video calls instant death. Stand near it, they say, and you have minutes to live. In 1986, that was true. It was one of the most lethal objects on the planet, but radioactive material burns through its own intensity over time, and the fiercest part of that burn happens fast. By the time the famous photograph was taken, the mass had calmed enough that a man could stand beside it for a short, carefully measured visit and walk away. The picture that gets passed around as proof of instant death is, in fact, proof of survival. And here is the detail that makes the myth worse rather than better. The genuinely dangerous material in that building was never the sculpture you can see and avoid. It was the fine dust, loose particles of fuel small enough to ride in on a breath, that a solid mass simply cannot do to you from across a room. People feared the wrong thing because the wrong thing photographed well. Which brings us to the wildlife, where exactly the same trick was played. Search for Chernobyl animals and you will find the 2-headed wolves, the deformed monsters, the deer that glow. None of it exists. There are no 2-headed wolves in the exclusion zone. What is actually there is subtler and, honestly, more interesting. Barn swallows with pale patches in their feathers, frogs that turn dark, insects with the symmetry knocked out of their wing patterns, forests that look completely healthy and have lost 2/3 of their birds. Radiation does not build monsters. It quietly breaks things at a scale too small to photograph, which is exactly why the monsters had to be invented. Which leads directly into the next thing everyone gets wrong about that forest. You have heard that the zone will be uninhabitable for 20,000 years, that nothing can live there, except people do live there. After the evacuation, a few hundred elderly residents simply walked back to their villages and stayed, and some of them lived out full lives in the houses they refused to leave. Workers have run the site continuously for decades. Guides took tourists through Pripyat for years. Parts of the zone are genuinely dangerous and will be for a very long time, but the number you keep hearing describes the worst pockets of contamination, not the whole territory. The exclusion zone is not a dead world. It is a strange, uneven, quietly living one. Now for the big one. The claim that Chernobyl nearly took out half of Europe. 3 myths left, and remember, the last one wasn't invented by television at all. The version you have heard goes like this. Molten fuel was burning down through the floor toward water underneath the reactor, and if it had touched that water, the resulting blast would have wiped out most of a continent. That is why the miners dug. That is why the divers went in. And here is where it needs splitting in two, carefully, because one half is true and one half is not. The fear was completely real. Nobody in 1986 knew what was happening inside that wreckage, and the danger of molten fuel reaching the groundwater and poisoning the rivers of an entire country was a genuine threat worth digging a tunnel by hand to prevent. But the thing people picture, a second nuclear explosion flattening Europe, was never physically possible. Reactor fuel is not bomb fuel. The uranium in a power station is nowhere near concentrated enough, and a bomb requires the material to be crushed together with a brutal precision that a burning ruin cannot produce. The worst case was a steam explosion. and a steam explosion in that building would have been catastrophic. It would not have been Hiroshima. Which brings us to the 3 men who were sent into the water beneath it. The divers. Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov. In the popular version, 3 volunteers step forward knowing they are about to die, wade into radioactive water to open the valves, save millions of lives, and are dead within weeks. Almost every part of that is wrong. They did open the valves, the water did drain, but they were not dead within weeks, and they were not really volunteers either. Ananenko has spent years telling anyone who asks that it was simply a job he was given. "I was ordered to go there, so I went," is how he puts it. He rejects the word hero outright, and the men who were supposedly doomed went home. Baranov lived another 19 years and died of a heart attack in 2005 at 64. Ananenko and Bespalov are still alive. All 3 were named Heroes of Ukraine in 2019. So how did 3 men wade through radioactive water and walk out of it? Partly because of the water itself. Water is an extremely good absorber of radiation, which is why spent nuclear fuel is stored in pools rather than behind walls. The very thing that made their mission look like a death sentence was also, quietly, shielding them while they worked. The strangest part is that the real version is better. 3 ordinary workers were handed an impossible job in the dark, did it properly, and then went back to work and grew old. That is not a lesser story. Somebody just decided dying was more cinematic. Which leaves the last myth, and it is the one that did the most damage to real people. That the operators caused it. That a room full of reckless men broke the rules, ignored the warnings, and blew up a reactor through sheer arrogance. It is the version the Soviet state pushed hardest, for an obvious reason. The button those operators pressed, the emergency shutdown, had a defect built into it. The control rods were tipped with graphite, a material that speeds the reaction up rather than slowing it down, and in the wrong conditions, pressing that button could push the reactor's power up before the brakes ever arrived. This was not a surprise. The effect had been observed at another plant of the same design 3 years earlier in 1983. A notice about it was circulated to senior management. It never reached the men in the control rooms. No fix was made. And after the explosion, engineers quietly went to every remaining reactor of that design and rebuilt the rods so it could never happen again. They fixed the button. Everywhere. Which tells you exactly who knew what. Now look at who ended up in a courtroom. In 1987, 6 men connected to the running of that plant were put on trial and several went to prison. Not one person who designed the reactor sat in that dock. The men who chose graphite tips to save money, and the men who buried the warning about what those tips could do, went home. That is what the myth was for. It gave the blame somewhere to land that was very far away from a drawing office in Moscow. Leonid Toptanov, the 25-year-old who pressed the button, never made it to that trial. He died 18 days after the explosion in a Moscow hospital. His mother asked him how it had happened, and he told her he had done everything right, that he had followed the regulations. He had. His family was later informed that the only reason he was not prosecuted was that he was already dead. That is the thing about the myths of Chernobyl. Most of them were invented to make a terrifying story more exciting, but some of them were invented to make somebody else look innocent. Not great, not terrible, just improved over and over until the truth needed digging out. If you want the version with the drama taken back out, stay with us. Subscribe and we'll keep digging.